All right, I think we are live here for Cocktails and Fishtales. Welcome to everyone who's joining us on this beautiful sunny July evening. We really appreciate you taking a little slice out of this beautiful night to join us here live on Facebook. My name is Carly and I'm the communications specialist with Harbor WildWatch. For those of you who maybe haven't joined us for Cocktails and Fishtales before, this program is a part of Harbor WildWatch's Science Social Series. It's held monthly, and they often feature a scientist, researcher, or environmental artist on an ecological topic. Now, these programs are traditionally 21 plus and held at a local taproom or venue, but we've made a bit of a shift during the pandemic to have them online for all ages and invite folks from all locations to come and join us. So if you're just hopping on, tuning in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We always love to see where folks are joining us from, whether that's in state, out of state, or sometimes beyond. These programs serve as an engaging and interactive way to learn about the environment and bring together eco-enthusiasts from kind of everywhere these days. So for tonight's program, I'm super excited to have Mary Krauser from Pierce Conservation District digitally joining us to talk about shoreline management. She's Pierce Conservation District's Shoreline Programs Manager. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Pierce Conservation District, their mission is to work with the community to improve water quality, promote sustainable agriculture, and create a thriving habitat. They also build just and healthy food systems for all. They do this through education, community engagement, and financial and technical assistance. We'll have a Q&A after Mary's presentation, so please feel free to ask questions along the way, or maybe save them until the very end, and Mary will answer them after her presentation. If you're not watching this live and you're watching on YouTube, please also feel free to email us at info@harborwildwatch.org with any burning questions you might have, and we'll get back to you. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Mary on board here and let her take it away.
All right, hello everyone. I'm going to just share my screen here. And are you seeing my screen?
It's thinking about it. Says you've started screen sharing.
Okay, we're going to try one more time.
There we go.
Okay. I'm glad you can see it. I can't. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right. So, hello everyone. So like Carly said, my name is Mary Krauser, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Shorelines Program Manager at Pierce Conservation District. And first, I'd like to thank Carly and Harbor WildWatch for having me here today as part of the series. Today, we'll be talking about shoreline management and envisioning Puget Sound shorelines that benefit people, salmon, and whales, and everything in between. To get us oriented, first of all, we're going to talk about what makes the shorelines of Puget Sound so special and unique. Then we'll talk about some challenges that our shorelines face, particularly due to population growth and development in our region. And finally, we'll talk about some of the work that's being done to preserve and restore functions of our shorelines to benefit us all. All right, so when we're talking about shorelines, we're really talking about the narrow strip where land and water meet, where really marine systems interact with terrestrial systems. And of course, our shorelines are also where many of us interact with and experience Puget Sound. If you're like me, you might enjoy exploring beaches at low tide. You might enjoy playing in the sand or in the rocks, taking in the views of the sound, maybe even swimming when the temperature is right. And in order to really understand how our beautiful shorelines came to be, we're going to roll back the clock and look a little bit at the geologic history of Puget Sound that led to the formation of these beaches and other shore forms that we love. So looking back in time at the most recent ice age, the Sound was formed by a period of advance and retreat of this big ice sheet out of Canada. This finger of ice called the Puget Lobe, which was sometimes thousands of feet thick, it stretched down into what is now the Puget Sound lowlands and really shaped the land and the water that we experience today. The weight of the ice depressed the land, and the movement of the ice as it periodically grew and shrunk and really formed what would become the Sound. It led to the shorelines that we have today. And there's evidence of this glacial and interglacial history that we can actually see. You might be familiar with our bluffs of Puget Sound that are quite beautiful. And in them, we can often see distinct layers of different sediments. Here we're looking at a bluff at Miller Peninsula State Park. And you can see those different bands of color are different sediments. And in these bluffs, you might often see things like sand and gravel and cobble, which are the same sediments that we end up seeing on our beaches. And that is not a coincidence. The beaches of Puget Sound are a little bit unique in that our sediments mostly come from eroding bluffs, not as much from river inputs, mostly from our bluffs. And since we have these diverse layers of sediments in our bluffs, we end up with diverse sediments on our beaches, which is part of what enables such a huge diversity of plants and animals to thrive in the Sound, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But as I said, our beaches here in Puget Sound are built from sediments that come from bluffs. In fact, we pretty much know exactly the areas of the shoreline that provide the sediments that feed our beaches. We call them feeder bluffs. And much of the Puget Sound shoreline can be divided into the three categories you see in this slide: feeder bluff, transport zone, where sediments are just kind of moving along the beach, and accretion shore forms, where sediments really build up. And this movement of sediment is really driven by waves. Wave action is constantly moving sediments around on our shoreline. And the bottom line of all of this is that our shorelines are dynamic. Change is the norm, and movement of sediments and erosion of sediments is what supports our beaches and enables life to thrive around the Sound. And as I mentioned, we do have a huge diversity of critters and algae living in the Puget Sound. It's a pretty magical place to live if you're a person who's interested in marine biology, like I am. We have a plethora of intertidal invertebrates who are my favorites, that creepy crawly stuff that lives in tide pools and stuff like that. And as any of you who have spent time exploring beaches at low tide will know, our diversity of sediments really does contribute to our diversity of life, because different biological communities live in different sediments. For example, on really muddy and sandy beaches, those areas might be dominated by things like clams and sand dollars, burrowing worms, and eelgrass. Whereas large cobble beaches may be dominated by things like barnacles and sea stars, limpets, and much more. But of course, the Puget Sound has more than just low tide intertidal organisms. We also have a lot of open water organisms, including a big diversity of fishes and marine mammals, of course, including our beloved salmon and orca whales. And then the Puget Sound is also home to a growing number of humans. The Office of Financial Management predicts that there will be an additional 1.5 million people living in our region by 2050. And when we think about the challenges that are facing our shorelines, population growth and development are at the top of the list. Development activities on the shoreline really contribute to deforestation, increased polluted runoff, and degradation of habitats in general. But we're going to focus in today on one particular aspect of shoreline development, which is shoreline armor. So for many, many decades in Puget Sound, it's been the norm when developing a shoreline property to cut down all the trees, build or develop really close to the water, and install some sort of hard structure with the intention of preventing erosion and fixing the shoreline in place. And this hard structure, which we generally refer to as armor, can take different forms. You can see some examples pictured here. It might be a concrete wall or a bulkhead, rock revetment, wood pilings, or some other material. And the main goal of this armor is to prevent sediments from moving around and to take what is naturally a dynamic system and fix it into a static state. And unfortunately, with armor being the norm, we see these structures have been built even in areas where it isn't really needed to protect any infrastructure like a home or a business. And we've also seen it installed in places where it just isn't really an appropriate solution for stabilizing a property. And a 2019 report from the Puget Sound Partnership showed that at this point, around 29% of the entire Puget Sound shoreline has some sort of hard armor installed on it. So in these images, the red along the shoreline shows where armor exists, and the green pop out is looking at Pierce County. And this armor is, of course, along things like railroads here in Pierce County. Much of our shoreline is railroad and armored there. But we also see armor on residential parcels on the shoreline too. And as you can imagine, building a hard structure on a beach or against a bluff to try to stop the natural processes of erosion and sediment movement has big consequences for our dynamic shorelines. So research in recent decades has started to really illuminate the impacts of armoring. And looking at the ecological impacts of armoring was how I was personally first introduced to this field. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Megan Detier out of the University of Washington. She's pictured here in the green sweater. And I worked with her on a study comparing armored and unarmored sites throughout Puget Sound. And it was really wonderful. I got to travel all over the Sound with a really cool crew of people, surveying and collecting samples during low tide. And of course, beach ecology is very complex, and there are many, many forces at play in the intertidal. Megan liked to say that we were looking for the signal of armor in the midst of a lot of other noise. But in general, we did see some differences between beaches with armor and those without. And we're gonna dive in on that a little bit. I know this is a busy slide, but we'll break it down here. So in general, we saw that beaches that have armor had less wrack built up on them. And wrack is what we call that seaweed and detritus that kind of builds up on a beach left behind by receding tides. There was also less wood that accumulated on beaches with armor. And both of those, the wrack and the built up wood, are important habitat for lots of different critters. We also saw that beaches with armor were less biodiverse in the intertidal. So we were looking under rocks, and we were looking in mud samples, we were looking under algae to see all the different species that were present. And we found that beaches with armor had a smaller number of species on them, both in the intertidal and in that wood and rack zone. And if you kind of zoom over toward the graphs on the right side of this slide, we also saw that beaches with armor looked different. They had a different character. Beaches with armor tended to be narrower and steeper and had coarser sediments. So more bigger rocks and less little sand and fine sediments. And the thing about that is that those little fine sediments are important for things like seagrasses and other algae to be able to grow in the intertidal and subtidal. And beaches with armor also tended to get more sun, which you can imagine would be a problem for organisms that normally live in the nice cool water, and then when the tide goes out, they get exposed to the sun, and turning up the temperature on them can have some big consequences. And in a more subjective judgment, many of these characteristics of armored beaches are just kind of less usable for recreation. Armor, like I said, can make beaches steeper and take away that nice comfy sand, but armor can also make beaches just harder to get to, and eliminate some of the things like driftwood and sand and creatures that we like to enjoy when we're at the beach. And if we zoom in specifically on some priority species in the Sound, we're going to talk, of course, about salmon and orca because they're very dear to us and very important in a lot of ways. So when we think about the impacts of armor, first on salmon, we see both direct impacts and impacts to their food chain. As I mentioned before, armor can starve beaches of sediment, particularly those small sediments like sand. And that small sediment is really important for forage fish. And when I say forage fish, I'm talking about the fish toward the bottom of the food chain, things like sand lance and surf smelt, who are food for bigger things like marine birds and salmon. And if you look at the picture on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, you see some surf smelt. Looks like they're almost dancing around on the sand, but they're actually spawning or laying their eggs. They come out of the water and lay their eggs high on the upper beach. And the thing is, they are pretty picky about the sediment in which they lay their eggs and the conditions that they need for those eggs to thrive and succeed. And so you can imagine if armor is reducing the suitable habitat for these forage fish to be able to spawn and maintain their populations, that's going to have impacts up the food chain to the salmon who eat them and to the whales who depend on those salmon. Recent studies have also demonstrated the importance of shallow water along the shoreline for specifically migrating Chinook salmon. The near shore is where these migrating salmon find their prey, but also where they escape predators themselves when they are small. They need those wide, low sloping beaches to be able to find that shelter. And as I said before, armor tends to make those beaches steeper, narrower, and often eliminates that shelter area along the shoreline. And of course, that's just one of the many challenges facing Chinook salmon in the Sound. I'm sure we're all familiar with, many other things that are negatively impacting their populations, and that's why they are endangered. And of course, Our endangered southern resident orca whales are also very picky eaters and really depend on Chinook salmon for really large portions of their diet. So those impacts, of course, travel up the food chain. And I do want to just briefly mention sea level rise. We are already seeing the impacts of sea level rise in the Puget Sound, and the prediction is, of course, that the rate of sea level rise will increase in the coming decades. And we do expect that rising water levels will compound the problems caused by shoreline armor. So if we stick with the forage fish example, we can see how sea level rise adds to the armor problem in this graphic prepared by Coastal Geologic Services. If you look at the top two images, you see a natural shoreline which is able to shift and change as the water level rises. The driftwood and the beach vegetation are moving landward, and there will continue to be upper sandy beach for forage fish to spawn in. But in the lower two images, the shoreline armor is again preventing change. It's holding things static. And the shoreline is unable to shift to rising water levels. And we see that the forage fish spawning area is lost. And again, we expect this will have ripple effects up the food chain to salmon, whales, and other species. And I'll just briefly mention that armor also affects our neighbors. If you recall the way sediment moves along our shorelines to build up on our beaches, you can imagine that having armor built on a feeder bluff, like is pictured in the red rectangle here, that's going to really affect the sediment that is able to be added to the system, but also travel along the beach. These processes of sediment movement really connect us to our neighbors. We like to kind of artificially chop up the shoreline into little parcels with property lines, but that is not how these processes operate. They really do connect us. And that's all I'm going to say about that, but if people want to talk more about that in the Q&A, we certainly can. So we just spent a good chunk of time establishing the problem. Now let's talk about solutions. The good news is there are lots of people throughout Puget Sound working on managing shorelines to make them benefit people, salmon, and whales. There are many organizations around the Sound that are working to reduce the impacts of shoreline development and specifically shoreline armoring from multiple angles. Some of you may be familiar with the Puget Sound Partnership's work to coordinate regional efforts to improve the health of Puget Sound, and armor reduction is one of the strategies that they developed, tackling both prevention of new armor and reduction of existing armor. And some work has already been done under this strategy. One example of that is that development regulations around the Sound have been updated in recent decades so that new hard armor is not allowed where it is not necessary. And in many jurisdictions, development on the shoreline is now more closely regulated than it was in the past. There are also now common alternatives to hard armor that are becoming better known by folks who are living and developing on the shoreline. There are engineered techniques for what we call soft shore stabilization, which can be used in some settings. And these soft shore techniques generally use natural materials and mimic natural processes to help stabilize beaches. And in places where armor was built unnecessarily in the past, people are doing work to remove that armor and restore beach processes. And finally, organizations like mine, like Pierce Conservation District, are working on educating folks throughout the Sound, including landowners and land managers, on both the impacts of armoring and what they can do about it. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about the alternatives to hard armor today, but I do just want to mention that these approaches generally tend to try to work with nature rather than against it. They tend to utilize a lot of natural materials, as you can see here, and in some ways mimic natural processes that allow the shoreline to maintain a certain amount of its dynamic processes and tries to make room for some change. Another way that folks are making room for change on the shoreline is by simply relocating development. In some areas of the Sound, we see folks doing things like elevating houses or moving them back away from the shoreline in order to accommodate those natural processes and adapt to sea level rise. And one of the programs that is working at a Sound-wide scale is the Shore Friendly program. Various agencies, including Pierce Conservation District, host these Shore Friendly programs that educate and engage landowners. So I personally get to work with landowners all over Pierce County in both raising awareness and also providing assistance. And we are seeing landowners really step up to take action. We see landowners acting as good stewards of their shorelines and making management decisions that are friendly to Puget Sound. People are taking preventative measures like adding native plantings and managing their stormwater, controlling invasive plants, and keeping trees on their shorelines to help prevent the need for shoreline armor. And in instances, like I mentioned, where armor can be removed, landowners are doing that. They are removing unnecessary armor and restoring their shorelines to natural processes that support fish and whales. And I'd like to share some examples of this. So the first one here is from Island County. This is a bulkhead removal at Cornet Bay. And as you can see, this wood bulkhead was pulled out, and this kind of vegetated sloping back shore was restored. And you can see that there are habitat features that were regained. Of course, the sandy upper beach where those forage fish might be able to spawn once again. But also we can see that this is a beach that's just going to be a lot more accessible to humans and a lot more usable for things like recreation. I could envision folks going out there and hanging out on the driftwood and looking for critters at low tide or exploring the dune grass in the back shore. And another example here on Dyes Inlet out of Kitsap County. This project was done with the help of the Shore Friendly Kitsap program. And you can see that this landowner traded in what was kind of empty lawn space for a really rich upper beach and back shore that really connects the marine system to this forested terrestrial system. And again, this beach is now much more accessible both for people and for forage fish to use. And finally, bringing it back to measurable impacts, we're going to talk a little bit about this sort of classic case of shoreline restoration, which was bulkhead removal and restoration at Seahurst Park in Burien. And this is sort of a classic case, I said, because really high quality research was done on this site, again, by Dr. Megan Detier out of UW and others, who actually were able to survey and collect samples at this site both before and after the restoration, and then at intervals following the restoration. And as you can see on the slide here, what they saw was that ecological conditions were really able to be recovered after restoration. It did take time. The last study that was published was for 10 years after the restoration was done. But now at Seahurst Park, they have reconnected this shoreline to a salmon-bearing stream, and we have seen forage fish spawning at this site, both surf smelt and sand lance. And of course, as you can see in the after photo, we now have a really expansive beach where people can recreate, and it's really once again a beloved feature of this area where folks can go and experience a shoreline that is really working for people, salmon, and whales. So with that, I would just like to thank you all for having me today, and again, thank Carly and Harbor WildWatch. I encourage you to, of course, stay connected with Harbor WildWatch about ways that you can continue learning and exploring Puget Sound safely during this time. And certainly if you have any questions or know someone who might have questions about shoreline management, especially in Pierce County, feel free to shoot me an email if you want to talk about management. But I am going to turn it over to Carly at this point to transition to our Q&A section of today.
Awesome. I think I have my video going. Oh, hello, there I am. Thanks so much, Mary. This was really interesting and I'm sure super relevant for everyone watching out there. And I love seeing those before and after pictures because it's such a significant difference when you look at it. And it's, it's nice to end on a positive note. We are going to do our Q&A session now. So if you have any questions, we already had a couple roll in, but if you have any questions, now is a great time to ask them. Again, if you're not watching this live, you are welcome to email Harbor WildWatch at info@harborwildwatch.org or shoot Mary an email directly at the email address that you're seeing on the screen right now. Either way, we can relay it to her. She can answer it directly. While we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, I have my own question about the soft shore techniques that you mentioned.
Sure.
And I'm curious about what those soft shore materials that are used, like what exactly are there? You kind of mentioned native vegetation, sediment, logs. Does it extend beyond that, or is that the primary techniques and tools used?
Yeah, so I guess I would add one more that's often used on the list is the addition of sediment. So it's commonly called beach nourishment. So yes, and I should mention that soft shore techniques really do need to be engineered solutions that use these different techniques kind of in combination, and I'm not just recommending that folks go and throw logs on their shorelines necessarily and call that soft shore protection. The other thing is, of course, that in Pierce County and I believe in most areas of the Puget Sound, soft shore is considered a type of shoreline development, if you will, in that it does have to be permitted by the county. So I do want to kind of put that disclaimer on this. But in general, yeah, so these soft shore techniques tend to utilize natural materials like large logs. Sometimes they can be anchored Really depends on the site, and they are really strategically anchored because, as you can imagine, having logs lower on the beach is not helpful, but right up against the toe of a bluff is also not helpful. So they have to be really precisely placed in the back shore. And then soft shore techniques do generally utilize some sort of native vegetation, particularly in the back shore, maybe even some riparian reconnection to help stabilize and help other woody materials accumulate, and also is also itself a form of habitat restoration. So these soft shore techniques they sound simple in that we say that they use natural materials, but they really are sophisticatedly engineered. And so that's why I don't want to talk too much about them, I guess, today.
Right. You don't want folks just going out and, like you said,
sure, yeah, exactly.
on the beach.
Yeah.
That's not exactly how you do it.
Yeah, I would mention just that, if folks are experiencing conditions on their shorelines that they are worried about, certainly they can connect with me and I can help point them in the right direction or connect them with the Shore Friendly program. But there's a lot of really great coastal geologists in the Puget Sound who are really great at working with landowners too. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We have a couple other questions. One is from Lindsay, who asks, can you point out any feeder bluffs that are in the Gig Harbor area?
Sure. So Point Evans is actually, so that's across the Tacoma Narrows from Point Defiance, and the Point Evans area is actually categorized as an exceptional feeder bluff, which means that it is doing exceptional work contributing to the sediment processes of the Sound. And you can really see those bluffs as you're driving across from Tacoma to Gig Harbor. You can see, not quite Point Evans, but you can see the bluffs right along the bridge. Those are all feeder bluffs.
Awesome. Another question that we have is from Eric, and I think I noticed this as your last slide, actually, where you had Malay sandspit up there. He was just asking if you were familiar with the Tacoma Malay Sandspit Nature Preserves Bulkheads project with Penn Met Parks.
Yes, I am familiar with that. I am actually working on them with that, or working on that with them. Yes. Yeah. It's that the Malay Sandspit Nature Preserve is a really special place in that it, interestingly, within the bounds of the preserve, has feeder bluff, transport zone, and accretion shore form. So that's what the spit is, where all that sand is building up. So it kind of has its own little, enclosed system right there. So it's a pretty cool place. And right now, unfortunately, there are some pretty significant sections of armor in the preserve. But it still is a really fabulous place. I'm excited to work on it with Penn Met Parks.
Cool. We do a lot of beach walks out there, so I'm very familiar with that.
Yes.
It's such a pretty area.
Yeah, it's a cool spot. Very cool. And there's both surf smelt and sand lance spawning documented there. So it's a great place for various critters to use.
Yay, forage fish.
Yes.
One more question for you, Mary, from Sarah. She's asking, are there other areas in Puget Sound that are in the process of changing back to natural?
Yes. Like asking about active restoration projects?
Yeah, I think touch on restoration projects, and are there natural processes that can change a shoreline from armored to non-armored? Is that a thing?
Well, yes, there are, but it really depends on the bulkhead or the armor, what it's made out of. So we have seen instances of especially wood piling bulkheads simply deteriorating over time, especially wood that hasn't been treated with creosote or whatever or anything like that. So yes, there are places that are, I guess, kind of naturally converting to unarmored shorelines, but there's also, there's a lot of work being done by, like I mentioned, lots of different agencies who host shore-friendly programs, but also by many other people, including several, state agencies, just working on removing armor. It is, like I mentioned, one of the strategies under the Puget Sound Partnership's regional plan. So it is a focus for a lot of different groups, including the salmon enhancement groups, I should mention, working on taking out armor, both on public properties like in parks, but also on residential parcels, because as we saw, almost a third of the sound at this point is armored, and so we really need folks from across the board to be involved in being part of the solution, and reducing the impacts of armor on our shorelines.
And if there are regular folks out there who want to remove armor from their own private beach, maybe a community beach, what resources might you recommend they take a look at?
Yeah, I would definitely direct them to their local shore-friendly program. All of the 12 counties around Puget Sound have some organization working on shore-friendly stuff. So certainly in Pierce County, I would encourage folks to reach out and get in touch with me. Working on the shoreline is a complex thing, of course, because we want to make sure when we are doing restoration, we're not causing harm in the process of doing a big construction project, like ripping out a big seawall. So it is carefully balanced, and we do need specific site conditions to be able to do restoration. But there are opportunities out there, and we love to have folks who are enthusiastic about it and folks who are already interested in taking out armor, especially on private property, to reach out to us, because those are the folks that we would definitely love to help.
Awesome. We have one more question from Lindsay, who's asking how long Pierce Conservation District has had a shoreline program for.
Yeah, so the shoreline program started in August of last year. It's new to Pierce Conservation District. So I was hired then to kind of get this program up and running. But as I mentioned, the shore-friendly program has been operational throughout Puget Sound for several years, and Pierce Conservation District partnered up with two other South Sound conservation districts, Mason and Thurston, to kind of expand their shore-friendly program into Pierce County. And so we are working off of a model that was developed by other conservation districts and has been operational for several years. So we like to share knowledge around the sound and across conservation districts, and with our nonprofit partners, because it takes all of us to improve the sound.
Definitely, I love that. We just have one more question rolling for you.
Sure.
Eric's asking if you're familiar with Orca Recovery Day at all.
I'm gonna stop screen sharing so you guys don't have to see these alerts.
There we go. Perfect.
Orca Recovery Day, absolutely. Orca Recovery Day is a really cool event that happens, well, I guess it started in, I believe, 2018, and now happens all over Washington State. And tons of folks are involved. I know Harbor WildWatch hosts events, conservation districts host events, businesses host events, people all over the state host various events to celebrate and encourage people to get involved with recovery of our southern resident orca whales. And, of course, every little group hosts a slightly different event, but they tend to involve, some sort of education and then some opportunity for folks to really get their hands dirty and contribute. So often we see folks actually being able to volunteer in some restoration effort or something like that. We actually, Pierce Conservation District in 2019 hosted our Orca Recovery Day at the Demolay Sandspit Nature Preserve and did a backshore planting restoration there. So Orca Recovery Day is great. It's really cool to see so many people mobilize across Puget Sound, but also across the state to support of course, the orcas, but also, everybody down the food chain too, all the way down to us who live in Puget Sound as well. Not that we're in the food chain, but, we're hopefully. But it's really about, habitat preservation and restoration overall in the Sound as well. And I don't know exactly what Orca Recovery Day is going to look like this year, but I'm sure that there will be some sort of event. It tends to happen in the fall, and would definitely encourage people to watch the Pierce Conservation District or Harbor WildWatch Facebook pages to stay informed.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in the same boat. We don't quite know what it'll look like. We do love Orca Recovery Day and have participated in a couple of times in different forms and locations. And if you're unfamiliar with it, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, I think both of us encourage you to look into it, and definitely stay tuned for how you can get involved with that in the fall.
Absolutely.
I think that's it for our questions and our presentation here. You're getting compliments as well around, everyone saying, thanks, Mary, nicely done, Mary. And I'll extend that on behalf of the whole Harbor WildWatch team. We really appreciate you coming on and joining us digitally for our program and talking about, again, such a relevant and important topic for folks, whether they have shoreline right in their backyard, or have favorite beaches, or maybe have privately owned shorelines. Really a great topic and a great presentation. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Of course. And if you want to learn more, you can visit Pierce Conservation District's website or their Facebook page, both of which we'll link here in the comments, and you should be seen on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube. If you want to learn more about Harbor WildWatch, we're at harborwildwatch.org. Find us on Facebook as well. And with that, I think I am gonna sign off here. I hope everyone has a good night, and thanks again, Mary.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.